podcast. My guest today is David Coggins. He's a New York City-based writer who has written extensively about style and is the author of The Optimist, and his latest book, The Believer, was released this spring. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks, Jeff. Great to be here.
So you've written a lot about men's style and manners. Why the shift to fly fishing?
Well, I don't want to say I wrote everything there is to write about that because that's certainly not the case, but fishing became a bigger and bigger part of my life. And I got lucky enough to write about it in small doses for a couple magazines, but for a general audience, really just, this is what bone fishing is, and usually me learning something and then failing at it immensely. And then I finally had I guess, courage to try to write an actual book about it. And that was a big step for me because there's a lot of not just fishing literature, but how-to literature, by true experts, which I do not consider myself. And I think sometimes if you're a writer, you gotta do what matters to you. And I don't want to say follow your heart. That sounds so schlocky, but if something is of importance, to let yourself kind of follow that thing.
So how'd you find your lane? Like you said, there's a lot of DIY stuff out there. There's the self-deprecating humor.
Yeah. Well, I guess I don't want to try to lay claim to self-deprecating humor. I do think it helps for me I love to travel and I love to fish, and I didn't always feel when I read things that I always felt what was at stake, or I wanted to explain to people. They're like, why are you fishing? Why are you doing this? And you say, well, you're in a beautiful place, but there's also this, and this is a thing you've worked at, and this is what you want to happen, and this is what often doesn't happen, or I got nervous, or I overshot my cast, or pulled the fly out of the fish's mouth. So I started to, it was helpful in a way to write for general audiences, because then you start thinking as opposed to a very rarefied expert angling audience, because then you start to, you know, feel that you have to explain what's at stake, what's a blueing olive, what does 5X mean, and try to do it kind of quickly while moving a narrative along. And I like fish stories. I like other people telling them. I mean, even though they can only really end a few ways. And often the way fishing writing is, it's like you fail, you try to do something, you fail, and then you succeed at the end. And I get caught up in that too myself. But I just tried to explain what it was like to be in a place, and what it's like to be with a guide or be in a beautiful setting, what you're trying to do, what you see. I think when we're fishing, we're often very kind of more attentive than we are at other times in our lives, especially if you're fly fishing and you're whatever trying to match the hatch or do some sort of something good, or trying, usually figuring out why what you're doing isn't working. That's up. And I think that if you acknowledge that you're not the expert early on, maybe people kind of come over to your side and they feel more sympathy with you, and then you can kind of take them where you're trying to go.
Was there any, I don't want to say backlash, but anybody that said, this is kind of outside your wheelhouse?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, they're old timers who think they own the sport. They fish in the Catskills, and it's not for everybody. I'm not trying I mean, I think there are lots of things about fly fishing in particular that have attracted a certain type of person for decades, for a long, long time. I mean, some people, like, the sport has many pe I love how broad the sport is, but I also like how specific other parts of it are. And if someone, like, I don't have any bamboo rods, but I understand why people get into that. I mean, and the fact that it's irrational, I like that. And if someone wants to, wear their grandfather's fishing vest, or, I mean, I like kind of old-fashioned clothes. Now everyone's in tech fabrics all the time. It seems like they're going to go climb a mountain when they're just going to really stand in a river. I don't know why they need all that stuff, but that's just life, and that's how these things go. And I think I couldn't be bound by how someone was going to uh, perceive what I did. And I mean, I fish with guys who, I mean, The Optimist begins with kind of two old timers who I fished with, friends of my grandfather's in Wisconsin. I'm from Minnesota, but I grew up going to a cabin in Wisconsin, still go there every summer. And those guys were be very skeptical of my kind of fancy. I mean, they thought everything was fancy. A fancy was sort of a car that had an air conditioner that worked. And so I knew that they would be somewhat dismissive of my writing, and just even like the idea of living in New York in general. But you guys have to get over that, or you're really not gonna get anything done.
Mhm. My first introduction to fly fishing was growing up on Prince of Wales Island in southeast Alaska. We'd
Mm,
ride our bikes down to the river and just jeans and boots. And
mm.
every once in a while we would see these people who look like they were out of an LL Bean catalog
Yeah.
and, have a pipe and everything. And we're out there, we got our spinning gear and we're throwing MEPS and Blue Fox lures. And we see this person who's intentionally complicating this. If this is a
Yeah,
meat
sure.
fishery, if this is about bringing fish home for food, then why are you flying, flicking around this fly around? It doesn't make any sense to me. And so I didn't start fly fishing until I lived in California a little bit after college. I
Mm.
thought this is actually there's something to this.
It's not the straightest line, is it? And I think that I understand, and I don't want to sound like I'm dismissive of people who are dismissive of me. I like some fancy things and I like bad beer and I like I think there's a very, if someone fishes, that's generally a person I can talk to and I like talking to them. And since I've written books about fishing, I've met a lot of people and it's been really, really nice. Often people who are a little intimidated by fly fishing, and I wish the sport was simpler. I wish people felt more welcome in it. I wish they didn't have that feeling that you had when you were a boy. You're like, why are these guys wearing these fancy things? I understand the desire to simplify it. And I even honestly, like, my girlfriend once, like, I had used a Tenkara ride I had, and she was so much happier because did not want to hear me use the phrase line management anymore. She was going to just, go very far away from me to a different part of the river. And all of my instruction, as well-meaning as it was not always welcome. And I think that a lot of people have that feeling, but I also think that and I struggle with it too. And even like, I don't know what gets into me where it's like, okay, I understand to a certain extent what I want to do for trout fishing. Now let's try a whole other thing. Let's go bone fishing. And you can't see the fish and you're setting the wrong way. And like, oh, now let's try Atlantic salmon fishing and the fish aren't there. You're trying to double hand cast. And it's like you're making the same mistakes you thought you were never going to make again. And honestly, like, I embrace that. And I don't mind feeling, in a lot of my writing is about putting myself back in that position to learn again. And there is a specific satisfaction when you overcome something that's hard. And I think that's why I feel an affinity with people who've also struggled through that to catch a fish on a fly. That's
Mm.
a great thing.
Did you feel that there was a level you had to achieve first before you went destination fly fishing? Because if you don't feel that you're very good at fly fishing, then going to try to catch a bonefish, it's like, I need one more season to get some
Yeah,
proficiency.
it's such a good question because you really, I'm going on a trip this summer and into Canada to this lodge, a salmon trip, and they asked you to like rank your ability. And it was sort of a moment of clarity where you're like beginner, medium, very good, or expert. And I stared at that thing for a long time. I think I chose very good. But sometimes you want to wait and you wait a long time and other times you do it too soon. You think you know something, then you look back. The first time I went to Patagonia, I had no idea what I was doing. That was decades ago. I was kind of going with my girlfriend at the time, so I had some other excuse to be there. It wasn't like I'd saved all this money, was going for 10 days. And I looked back and I like, I was really behind the curve there. Sometimes you get pushed into it. The first time I went bone fishing was my friend, his cousin dropped out of the trip, and with 2 weeks to go, he said, "Oh, you got to come." I went to Andros, and it changed my angling life. I love bone fishing. I couldn't believe how beautiful the flats were. Sometimes you just have to go, and I recommend to anybody. I go flats fishing a lot in the Bahamas to a what the website calls a budget-minded accommodation for the bonefish obsessive. And I was like, oh, that sounds good, where you pay by cash and an envelope. And it was great. Like, and if I had waited till there's no way, some of these things, there's no way to do. Like, watched videos about trying to see bonefish. I was staring at photos. I was like, oh, but I mean, you have to do it. And um, you have to kind of live through it. And that makes it, of course, there are painful moments, but it also makes it that much more satisfying when it comes together.
Hmm. What are you looking for in the trip? Obviously, there's the fishing aspect, but there's the whole
Mm.
environment aspect too. So, are you looking at like where you're staying and the guides and what makes a really good trip?
Good question, Joe. I mean, this is a big one. It really depends. Like this place I just mentioned in the Bahamas is extremely modest. Like you make your own breakfast, they just drop off dinner. You kind of have to bring your own booze there's like these crazy no-see-ums, so you can't really go outside at night and watch the sunset. You're kind of in this porch sitting inside it, like right in front of an industrial strength fan. So it is lacking some of the things I would want in other places. But that's kind of an outlier. I don't mind. Like if they have the fishing program, I like nice guides for starters. I don't want to be yelled at, and I don't. I'm not a competitive angler. I would never get mad at a guide or try not to unless there was, I mean, once a decade I have a disagreement with someone on the water. I other times though I like the big picture. I mean, I love Argentina. I love going to Buenos Aires, and then I love going to Patagonia and the whole feeling and the culture there and the way the guides are. You can't really have a bad day on the water there. I mean, even though I've been shut out for sure. I mean, trout fishing too, not like sea run trout, like just brown trout on very clear waters, very hard fishing, had my heart broken. But I love being there. I love the landscape there. And I think when you go on a trip, you're in this heightened state because you know the time is limited. And so you sometimes you put too much pressure on yourself because you know it's going to end, or it's usually halfway through, or you're like, wait a minute, I don't like to do the math. Like, how much am I paying for each fish? That's not going to do any good. I mean, and now I'm like obsessed with salmon fishing, and I'm, getting shut out right and left, and these things, these things happen. So I think you want to be in a beautiful place, and you want to kind of give yourself over to having a whole experience. Like if I'm sitting in traffic in New York, and I'm like, I would do anything to catch no salmon in Scotland right now.
Right.
So when I'm in Scotland catching no salmon, I shouldn't complain. Of course, it doesn't stop me from complaining, but you want to be in a place and you want to feel close to that place and connected to it, the people who are there, or if you're alone, but you want to open yourself up to being in a place that matters to you. And I think that makes our lives better even when we
Hmm.
come back home.
Is it easy for you to kind of not want something that isn't available when you're on some of these trips because you're down in Patagonia and you're getting those really nice lunches and you're having wine and you're having steak for lunch? Is
Yeah.
it easy for you to say that's Patagonia, that's not here? I can't be wanting that in this location.
Well, I mean, to eat lunch in Patagonia, these streamside lunches that these guides make, like an actual hot lunch is just, it's so great. You almost can't believe it. And you always, drink a little too much wine, and reflexes are a little slower afterward. And I think what happens on these trips is that you find, and I think fishing in general, and I'm sure you found this too, is like you find the level of difficulty that makes sense for you. I'm really interested in that. And I think I love bone fishing, at least where I go, because like kind of you can have a good day, you can struggle, it's always hard. You're usually casting to singles or pairs. I like to wade fish in Patagonia, and like to me, if a day is like the average number of fish is sort of 4 or 6, a really good day is 8, and a tough day is 2, but like you appreciate each one. I don't want to catch a ton of fish. I want it to be hard, but also I don't just want to cast to one fish once a day. And if I blow the cast, that's it. Like that's too much pressure for me. Maybe one day I will want that. And that changes over time too. I think if you take a young person out, or a certain person gets to Patagonia, they're like, yeah, I'll catch 20 fish, 20 18-inch rainbows on a dry dropper all day and be thrilled for that. And that, like, there's a time and you're with your friends and you're drinking beer and like you're in Patagonia. Other times you want something a little more specific. And I think I'm interested in how that changes as we go through our lives. I have friends who are just like, forget permit. I am not ever going to waste my time with that. And someone else is like, game on, let's do this. And someone else is just like, I can't handle the heartbreak. I just don't like, I already have enough brush. I'm on vacation. Why am I ruining my life?
Yeah. In the introduction to The Believer you wrote, when you have a lot of time, it's not something you think much about. When you realize there's less time, things unfortunately start to move more quickly.
Mm.
What made you kind of come to that realization? Was it on a trip, or that concept of time was that really, when I read that, I thought, oh man, that's where I'm at right now.
Well, I think it happens when you get older, for starters. A little bit thinner on top in my case. And it also happened during COVID because my girlfriend moved in, and a lot of the believer deals with, like your girlfriend or your wife. Like if you travel to fish, you're not being with her. And so you start to think about when you're away from the rest of the world during a pandemic, you're like, how do I want to live my life? How am I going to live when I can travel again, when I can leave? I mean, I read a lot about travel too, so I was used to being on the road a lot. And when I was stuck in a small Manhattan apartment, I was thinking, what am I going to do after this? How do I want to conduct myself? And I was like, I want to fish and go to these places that I can go. Maybe at some point I won't be able to go to on them if, depending on domestic things or just how your life evolves. And so I wanted to have this year. And so The Believer is about one year where I did all the things I hoped I would ever want to do. And of course, it didn't work out that way. And the pandemic came back, and New Zealand was closed, and Japan didn't consider fishing a meaningful activity. I couldn't get a visa, so this thing still happened. And so I do. I mean, the book begins, it's like I'm halfway through my life, even though it's sort of a joke because I've been saying that for years. But when you get certainly to life's second half, you start being aware that you're lucky when you can do these trips. Your friends back out, someone moves, someone's got a kid, someone got their hip replaced for goodness sake. And you just have to enjoy this time when you have it. And I think something about fishing is very related to time. When you're on the water, you're really feel like you're kind of away from this other part of your life, and you're engaged in this other, especially if it's seasonal and you go back. And even though we're talking about travel, like home waters, my goodness, that's like a different connection to, I remember what I did at the beginning of April last year, and the fishing was bad then, it's better now, or the seasons change. I think this sport is very much connected to seasons and time, and then as you get older, aging, and your friends who you fish with and who aren't around anymore.
Mhm. We've seen a lot of that here.
Big answer on that one. Sorry. But
No,
time, these are the questions. Like once you start with this stuff, you end up, thinking about bigger things.
yeah. Yeah, we've seen that a lot in Southeast Alaska with the amount of people who are on the tourism circuit and the amount of cruise ships that are coming up. I think Ketchikan's going to get just shy of 2 million passengers, and it's only a town of 12,000 people. So we'll have days that there's 15,000 tourists in town off the cruise ships
Oof.
alone. And that's that same sort of, we got to do it because we might not have the chance again. So make that happen.
Hmm.
And growing or living through that, it was interesting to see a lot of the students that I teach and how they were coping with it. And a lot of them, hiked and went halibut fishing from kayaks and just did a lot of
Mm.
really healthy things because we lived on an island. So it was so many outdoor opportunities. And for the kids who found that as a meaningful way of getting through that, I think they came through so much better than a lot of those kids who didn't have those options.
Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, the pandemic, that's a whole other thing, but having an outdoor connection in your life is, I don't know many people who would give that up.
No. Is there an era that you'd like to go and fish? If you think back, it's kind of a useless exercise because the whole born in the wrong century type
Yeah.
things
Yeah.
where, like they didn't have penicillin, it's like, I,
No.
I want to go back there and catch these fish, but well, would you want typhoid fever? So as far as like, if you had a DeLorean,
Right.
where would you go?
No, it's such a good question. I think about it. I always tell my friends, usually when we like see people that we don't like, there are too many people on the river, everyone complains, but I say, not a day goes by when I fish where I am not grateful for the gear that we have now. I mean, it's just not just like neoprene, but just every single thing and desiccant. I mean, what we're keeping our flies dry, and we've got 1,000 benefits that no one has ever had. And I try to keep that in mind when I start moaning about these things. I mean, I guess I would want it to be, like you're saying, close enough to our life that we still recognize most of the benefits of modern medicine. I mean, probably the 70s would be good for me. I mean, when I fish with these old timers, they would tell me about like when they started going out to Livingston, out to Montana. They started to fish a lot in Florida. They, a little bit tourism beginning in Patagonia. And I think that time, I guess that's about 50 years ago, that's like close enough to where, we'd recognize what's going on. We could use some American, travelers checks or whatever. But I mean, if you want to go 50 years back in time, go to fish in Cuba. I mean, the second you land, your phone doesn't work. You can't use apps. You can't make credit card payments. Everything's cut off there. And then once you get out to the water, you're really just in a different situation. And I don't mind that. I don't mind it. And if I go to Maine or certain parts of Wisconsin or Canada that haven't changed a lot, I like that feeling. I like being. I can't trust myself to turn off all my devices. So I like, even where I fish in the Catskills, there's no reception, and I sometimes I need it imposed on me. Otherwise I'm gonna check my phone, which is a terrible habit that most people have, myself included.
So how do you document your trips? Obviously, there's an element of I want to take a picture of maybe a couple of the fish that I catch, but you don't strike me as a nonstop Instagram reel. Here's me at the river type.
Yeah, I it's a complicated thing. I'm against fish photos. I think and video. I understand the years ago I wrote something. I there was a Tumblr called like women in holding fish.tumblr.com. I mean, crazy. And it was just that, like often women in bikinis on like Florida pleasure boats holding fish, but also like serious anglers and their waiters or whatever. And I was like totally fascinated by this and slightly appalled. And I love to look at fish photos. I think to me, I'm interested in a bigger experience. I take lots of photos and videos of water, and I love to be in a place and I love to remember it. Um, I occasionally take fish photos and I take release videos. I do like to remember certain things, but I don't do, grip and grin and that. And I'm a little uncomfortable with the kind of currency of that, the grip and grin and Instagram. And then then you're posting it, and then people are tagging me in pictures where they're, holding some poor trout within an inch of its life. And I know they're proud of it, but it's like I don't want to kind of contribute to that. And I think these videos confuse people about what to expect. Like they think it's like highlights in a soccer game. There's like two goals in the whole soccer game, and they're just, you see highlights and you think the action's nonstop, and it's like a sugar high that is a little bit destructive. But it's complicated. I mean, sometimes I'm a guest somewhere and they want to share a photo of me with a fish and or it's a guide and he wants to prove he caught some huge thing and that's like helps their business. And of course, how are you going to stand between them and that for 5 extra seconds? So it's it's complicated. I like to remember things for sure. And I like to I do like a good release video makes me very happy. And if you see a fish in the water, it usually looks bigger anyway. So
Yeah. Yeah, there's no
that's what I tell
barrier.
myself.
The traditional barriers of entry are gone. If you were going to contribute some sort of content to the space, you had to have an
Mm,
editor, publisher, someplace for it. But
mm,
now with social media and with blogs and websites, anybody, this podcast, this is not a,
yeah,
it's just home podcast type thing. You've kind of your career has been on both sides of that. How has it
yeah.
maybe improved, or what are some benefits that have come with it, and what are some negatives?
Yeah, that's a nice transition and a very good a good thought. I mean, I think about this a lot. I started writing for magazines and wrote a lot for art magazines for some of the best editors I've ever met in my life. These women editors at Art in America were absolutely brilliant. Taught me so much, like pretty ruthless with my work. I would like put a joke in every time. It would come out every time. I realized later you're supposed to put two in, then they take one out and then leave the other one in. But it was really hard to write. I started with exhibition reviews and then started to do bigger interviews and book reviews and then artist profiles and that was really a great education for me, but it was long and took time. And then I kind of had this feeling, this is going back to the very first question you asked, where I wanted to write about different things, not just art. So I tried to write about the things I cared about, tailoring and design and drinking whiskey and fishing, and no editors would let me do it, not one. Even though I'd written cover stories, major stories. And they said, well, we haven't seen your writing about wine. How are we going to let you do it? And I was like, well, you can see these other things. It's clear that I can write and I can just switch it over to wine. And they said no, so I kind of went back to the drawing board and wrote for little money or no money for small publications or my friends' websites and just to have these clips. And so that was an example of like there being barriers to entry. And I vowed if I was ever in a position and I just thought someone was a good writer, I don't even not a writer, I would encourage them to write something. And I've commissioned many people to write things that don't have a kind of traditional background. Um, so then I was lucky enough to start to get into men's magazines and other places and got to write about all these things, which is great. But it's frustrating. Half of those magazines don't exist anymore. RIP Men's Vogue, among millions of others that are gone. And so I started to write books, and then I started to write a Substack, which completely changed my professional life in a way I never expected. I didn't really even understand what a newsletter was exactly. I thought of a newsletter as like like a expert in Silicon Valley would write to prospective investors, hardcore research that people paid hundreds and hundreds of dollars for, like analytic-y things. And my friend made me sign up. Signed up for Substack on a Friday afternoon in August, probably the worst time to launch something, but I just didn't stop. I didn't think about it. I knew if I thought over the weekend, I wouldn't do it. sort of like signing up for a fishing trip the first time when you're not good enough. And Substack changed my professional life. I've got, a small, some group of paid subscribers. Like I make my living from that, and that's a direct connection to my audience, and it's really wonderful for me. I can, I have a lot of experience writing and editing, so I think I'm pretty well equipped to handle that, if I can say that. I mean, if you do something for 20 years, you should have sort of a sense of, and that has allowed me to connect to an audience in a way that I really like. And so I have these kind of three-way I connect to people through the newsletter, which is very immediate and nice. And then I do magazine stories, which come out periodically, which is nice because I can work with an editor. And then I have these books that come out every 2 or 3 years, major projects that more permanent and more intense in a way. And so I try to balance all those things together and have one foot in kind of the old way of doing things and one foot in the new way. And um, I still wish there were more magazines. I think it's a nice way to read, but at some point you can't just lament that. You got to deal with the world. And if you want to have people read your work, you can't get too precious about where they read it.
Yeah, I love the feeling of a newspaper, feeling of
Oh,
a
sure.
of a magazine. You kind of know where you're
Yeah,
at too. It's a lot easier to kind of see when
completely.
you get on the wrong page and well, where's the next button?
Yeah.
Am
Oh,
I going
God.
start to finish? Who knows? But
Completely. And you discover things. For my entire life, from the day I got to college, my dad signed me up for a student rate of the New York Times. And got the New York Times delivered to me every single day. Moved to New York. I lived in Japan. I got the Yomiuri Times with the New York Times supplement, always the New York Times paper, start the day. And you read so many things, discover so many things. And then they kept not getting delivered here in New York. I finally just went digital, and now I just kind of go to things I think I'm going to need to know, and I don't discover things. I don't read about something I didn't know about because I'm kind of navigating through the, news of the day or whatever. And that's a real loss. And I think that's kind of a cultural wide loss because most of us are just fed the things that are based on what we already know we like. And so the sense of discovery, you have to work much harder to enjoy that.
yeah, you're fighting the algorithm that's feeding you what's going to
For
keep you
sure.
connected, and you're not
For sure.
happening upon something that you wouldn't have otherwise found.
I mean, it's like sometimes the algorithm works for you, but sometimes you gotta get outside it. Like a woman at this bookstore, wonderful bookstore around the corner from where I live, like a friend to me recommended a book, a great book by this English novelist, Isabel Colgate from 1980 or so called The Shooting Party. So 200 pages, really wonderful book, takes place kind of in the early 1900s. And this book is so great that I told the woman at the store who gets recommended things all the time. I know her, but I would really don't want to recommend things because she's just overwhelmed with that. But I just said, this book is great. You should get it. Then she read a different book by the same author that she recommended to me. I saw it on the shelf, staff picks, and then it kind of circled back around. And I was like, this is the algorithm I want, where
Hmm.
it's like a person recommends something based on something I said to her, and I trust her. And it felt all happened at a human scale over the course of 6 months, not like through 2 clicks. And I got kind of happy and sad at the same time about this thing or this lack of how that happens. And it's that's just the way the world works now. And the idea that you would save up money to buy a record and listen to it all the way through is insane. I mean, I read somewhere songs are getting shorter because it counts as a listen if you make it to the halfway point or something on Spotify. It's madness.
Yeah, one verse, a chorus, and then just repeat it if
Yeah,
need be.
exactly. Exactly. It's like can I make a Spotify setting where I get songs that are longer than 3 minutes? I want to not just I don't want it to sound like an ad,
Mhm.
a jingle.
My wife and I were watching. I can't remember what movie it was, but a CD was like the modern technology, and it was funny because like this movie is not that old, but CD is
Oh man.
completely obsolete. So in just a short period of 2 decades, it went from totally modern
Yep.
to totally ridiculous.
Yeah.
It's just wild how fast it's happening.
No, I remember seeing my friend's father or stepdad had a CD player. He's like a real audiophile. It was probably like 1980, God, six or something. We like stared at this thing. We weren't allowed to touch it so we had to do it while he was gone or something. And like staring at the bottom of the CD, and it's like everything was really heavy, the stereo, and like this was the most modern. transformative thing ever. And now it's, I was selling some at a used store in New York. It was absolutely humiliating watching the guy go through my stack of college rock from the 90s and deciding he's like, we've got a lot of music from this era. I'm like, I'm sure all the 40-year-old guys tried to get rid of their CDs.
Yeah,
I
I
think
was I was playing. I can't remember who I was playing, but I was in my class, and student said something about this is like old divorced male stuff. I was like, no, this reminds me of college. This is like a period of time. I'm not sad. I'm remembering college. Leave me alone.
that's no, I completely. It's past the natural light. It's yeah. I mean, you don't realize that you're in a cohort until a younger person is like categorize you as a sad dad.
Yeah. What about Audible? What about listening to books? Have you done any of that? And
Yeah,
do you
well, it's fun.
consider it reading if you do listen to it too? Do you say I read the book or do you specify, okay, I listened to this book?
I say I listen to it. I'm very specific about what I listen to. Like it has to be a certain type of book. I would never ever listen to a novel. I don't. It like it's funny because I thought a lot about this when they asked me who was going to read The Optimist, my previous book, and the first they asked me if I wanted to do it, I did not. Like every sane person, I don't like my own voice, but it then they sent me five readers who could do it. And I started playing them and I just started laughing because it's sort of like who's playing you in a movie of your life because it's a book told, from my point of view. So this person would have to sound like me or impersonate, not impersonate me, but embody me in some way. And that was like very strange. And the guy did a good job. But then for this one, we managed to get Scott Brick, who has like the best voice. He's done Hamilton, he's done Devil in the White City. He's like absolute great voice. And even that is sort of strange to hear him kind of not pretending to be me, but speaking from in my I like a memoir or preferably in the voice a first person memoir. I guess all memoirs are first person, like a something told from the point of view of a person, like diaries or memoirs. So it's really coming from that person. So something like Chips Channon's diaries, which are definitely not for everybody. But or like E.B. White's essays are great. Something like that, like Hunter S. Thompson's letters are my one of my favorite audiobooks, volume two, Fear and Loathing in America. Now, but that's because that's him talking it, and the guy who's got a great voice, Malcolm Hill Gardner, is uh he's speaking, you're understanding directly what's happening, and it's not like literature exactly, which I think is a little different category.
So if someone were to say, I listened to your book, would you say, thank you? And if someone said, I bought the hardback, oh, thank you very much. How would that be? How
No,
would that go?
well, the economics of this are funny because you make way more money from an audiobook because you're just paying for nothing. It's just a download. You get way less money from a book, hardcover book, because you got to pay for all the stuff. Not that I think about these things that granularly, but I think if I the guys reading a book, my book, they're not really selling it. Like they're not like you don't if someone's speaking to you and you're just doing something else while you're listening to it, you don't quite know, are you coming to the end of a chapter? You don't have a sense of you just generally don't quite appreciate the language as much in my experience. That may be not true for everybody, but like if I usually the last line of something, that's an important situation. And if you are coming upon that yourself, you are prepared for it. If it's the guy's reading it and there's just a pause afterward, maybe you weren't prepared for it. You have to go back to it, or you didn't quite like there's momentum in how this thing is. It's not written to be read. It's written to be read aloud.
Yeah.
It's written to be read to oneself. And so that I'm fascinated by these things. I mean, I've listened to some super long audiobooks like like The Best and the Brightest. I mean, I like history for that, or like um the Robert Caro books about Robert Moses, Power Broker. I mean, that's 50 hours and I was just could not have been more into it. And often I buy a book afterward after I've listened to it, and then I like read parts of it again. And I'm fascinated by all this stuff. It's
Mhm.
just I mean, very much part of my life in a way.
When you are listening to it, are you like doing the dishes or walking somewhere? Because I know sitting down and reading, that's a posture that you can get behind. Okay, I'm focusing all my attention. I'm sitting down. But if you were to do the same thing for listening to a book, it would just look odd to just kind of tilt your head and stare off into space.
So I should say I used to listen to a lot more audiobooks and now I'm really in the podcast world. I listen to a zillion podcasts and it's probably not good for me. I listen to podcasts when I used to read, like in New York. If I mean I listen to podcasts when I'm walking around. I listen to them if I'm on the bus. I listen to them if I'm, on an airplane often. I love podcasts. A podcast is just I don't know why I like it so much, but it if I like the people talking, I generally like it when people are talking, like friends who are talking to each other. I mean, I like interviews like this, but what I actually listen to are like two people talking about like sports. I don't even have to like the sport. Or two people talking about popular culture. Don't have to like what they're discussing. If I like the chemistry between them, I'm very happy to be around those people, and I find it reassuring. I mean, I didn't even think about podcasts until, 8 years ago, probably. So I listen to podcasts more, and then books if I'm like on a long distance drive and I want to like get in to do something. And then if I do, I will listen to a novel if I've read it before, and I'm like, what would it be like to hear this? I like this story, The Good Soldier by Ford Maddox Ford, and then I consider it a slightly different experience than reading the novel. You just want to like hear something like Brideshead Revisited or For Whom the Bell Tolls or some classic, and it's nice.
Mhm. Yeah, podcasts have changed so much about education as well.
Mm.
It's hard to listen to really great communicators and then go to a staff meeting because then
I wasn't expecting. Yeah, I'm
yeah.
sure.
And then a lot of my students, especially during coming out of COVID, they've listened to philosophy and
Mm,
psychology and more personal growth than self help.
mm,
So
mm,
they're so much more curious and they have different questions about how things work. And it's just another way to access that curiosity. They don't have to be at school to learn. So some of the high achieving kids
mm,
are just so much more in tune with, not what's going on as far as, this team with this colored tie is angry at this team, just more, super interesting. And it's a really good benefit for a lot of students. And it's been interesting.
that's very interesting. I'm glad to. It's reassuring. It's like some technologies. I think we can focus on the way they're delivered and not focus on the thing. And so we're like, oh, it's the streaming platform or it's this, AirBuds and iPhones, but well, that's just in service of conversation and communication and in literature. And then that is a good thing. And if it was at one point it was listening to the BBC wireless, 80 years ago, and now it's this, and there are still a lot of worthwhile things that we can listen to.
Yeah. I caught one of my students sitting by himself during lunch and just had earbuds in. I was like, part of the social experience in high school is to communicate with other people rather than just sit there and listen to music. And he said, no, I was listening to a podcast about how our brain converts memories. And I thought, oh, all right. Well, sorry to assume that you were listening to mindless music. Good for you for educating yourself, but maybe talk to some people too.
Yeah, no, it's nice to talk to people.
So your podcast, why did you get started with that? Was that about the same time that you started on Substack?
A lot of this stuff I do with my friend Michael Williams. He has a website called The Continuous Lean. He's been in the early adopter in the online space, had a first blog called The Continuous Lean. And he was the one who made me do a Substack, and I wouldn't have done it if he hadn't told me probably. And then he said, "Let's do a podcast," or I said it, or somehow we just did it. And I don't know about you, Jeff, but sometimes it's like embarrassing to start something, but then once you do it for a while, it's fine. Once people are like, "Oh yeah, you have the podcast," and I don't. Speaking of like sad dad music, it's like, oh, now sad dad podcast or whatever. At least that's what we were thinking. And then after, it's sort of like if you went way back, I was like, oh God, I don't want to join Facebook. It's so embarrassing, or it's not what I'm about, or people are going to make friends who know me who think I'm a snob are going to be like, ooh, look who's on Facebook. And then like nobody cares. Like you just do. Nobody cares if you have a podcast. Nobody cares if you're on Facebook, though I'm still not on TikTok. That just freaks me out. But so we started to do it. And it was fun because Michael, who lived in New York forever, now lives in Los Angeles. And so in a way, it was just a way to talk to each other. And I'm not really good on the phone, but this is like just a way to have a kind of a friendship. We tried to do interviews, it didn't quite work. Two people in two different places interviewing a third person, and though Michael says it's just because I want to talk more. But and so about every week we have a conversation, and it's been really nice for us. I think I mean, it's behind the paywall, so it's for people who subscribe to either his newsletter or mine. And but when I do book signings, probably the mo thing I get commented to the most are people who listen to the podcast. And it's not the people you do, it's older guys too. It's not like, and I think there's something, parasocial relationships and all that stuff where people feel like they know you or they want to hear what you're up to and following along. And there's an intimacy to podcasting that I enjoy way more than I expect. And it's great to talk to Michael. And I think I enjoy it more than he does, or at least that's how he plays it up. But that I'm bothering him. But that kind of gives us a specific dynamic that I hope works out.
Mhm. It's a great opportunity to be super honest. You don't have to worry like there's really no editing. There doesn't have to be editing,
Yeah.
and it's amazing to see just how many people like you don't have to go for millions of people. You're even tens
Yeah.
of thousands or hundreds of
Yeah.
thousands. Just if 100 people, 200, 300 people a week just tune in, and
Yeah.
it's like, all right, cool.
No, I completely agree, and I also think that it's a medium that people understand it the way you do it. So some are very polished and have, interstitial music and then that makes sense for that, and others are more like the just like a picnic table instead of a restaurant, and that's ours. Like we don't have music. We just turn the thing on, Michael starts, and no one is like upset about that. The audio is, a little wonky, and we don't really apologize. We kind of want it to be good, just or we for ourselves to enjoy it and connect with, just like you said, a small but I don't want to say passionate audience, a small but appreciative audience,
Yeah.
and that kind of keeps our little media ecosystem going and our Substacks, and it all kind of works out pretty well for us.
So what's next for writing projects and for fishing?
It's a good question. I'm going salmon fishing tomorrow to Canada. I'm very excited about that. And though the the host of the trip did say maybe we should bring some trout gear too, which is a little bit concerning to me. Uh, maybe the fish aren't up in the river yet. I'd say I'm doing a little bit of salmon fishing this summer, which I'm very excited about. And I fish in the Catskills. That's sort of my home water. So and that's kind of where I have my, you know, go through the seasons, and I really love that, and more kind of hosting people to the place where I usually fish and sharing it with them. Often I don't even fish. I kind of guide them a little bit and just make a few casts, and that's pretty nice. And then I got some writing projects. I mean, I write for the Financial Times Magazine, and so we do these. I work with this photographer named James Harvey Kelly, who's wonderful, and he and I go on these kind of trips. We went to Scotland, and he photographs them, and they really they really look stories really look great, and that's the sort of thing you're talking about, media like in print, beautiful photos, it's laid out a certain way, which is really nice. Actually, one of our stories from Scotland came out while I was in England, and it was just cool to like be in a pub where they put out the Sunday papers, and there it was, and you just like with your breakfast could see our work right there. And so I got a couple of stories that I'm working on for the Financial Times, and I'm working on another book proposal, not fishing, but sports related, and when that happens, I'll blast that out into the world.
When you say salmon fishing, I'm assuming East Coast Atlantic salmon.
Yeah, sorry. Out here, the heartbreaking one, this Atlantic salmon. I kind of getting into it in a way that like my double hand cast is getting better. I just want it to be adequate. Don't need to make it a work of art. And I got it's hard. That's hard fishing. It's hard, but I like the difficulty of it, or I just like the pace, I should say, the pace of it. And I like the trips and the landscape and the water, I like even the chance to be connected to an Atlantic salmon is pretty special. The migrations and the history of that animal is remarkable.
Any plans to come out to Alaska or come out west?
It's the last state. I've been to 49 states, but not Alaska. And I'd like to change that. I gotta scheme up. I think I look at these lodges, and then I get in like, oh my God, rainbow trout this or that. And then I'm like, okay, it's too big. I don't understand it. How do I start? And it's sort of like going to Montana for the first time, but there's 18 times further to get there. So I mean, I went to British Columbia. I went to Terrace, which is incredible. And then I was like, wait, how far is it to drive from here to Alaska? And like, not that far. And like, this is insane. But the problem is, how do you get your car to Terrace? So then I was like, okay, well, if you drive from Vancouver to Terrace, that is like also insanity because you got to go around all those like bays and stuff. It's not a straight shot, obviously. And then I got all these crazy ideas about how long to what Michael and I call associated days, which is like how many days are you fishing? And you're like, oh, 6 days. It's a 6 days of fishing. Then you're like, well, how long is the trip? And you're like, oh, it's 14 days because you're stopovers or long drives or other various idiotic things I end up doing. So I mean, if you got to point me in the right direction, I mean, I have caught some of those beautiful salmon out there, but I like it I need to struggle a little bit. I don't want to make it too easy so I was looking at some huge rainbow trout that looked very beautiful. And some isolation and get away from 15,000 people off a boat and
Yeah. Yeah,
you got a
brutal.
deal.
It's such a huge state that it's just so diverse. You got your
Yeah.
steelhead fishing, and then you got trout fishing, but then
Mm,
trout fishing in Southeast Alaska because most of the rivers are island rivers. So you have
mm,
such a smaller amount of drainage. So the rivers are a lot smaller. You don't have those big 30-inch residence fish like you do in Bristol Bay area that are
mm,
mainland rivers. So Bristol Bay area is unbelievable. You got brown bears there. You got
mm,
not as much DIY type stuff, and then
mm,
you can go further north for grayling and char. There's just a lot
mm.
of stuff. It's kind of I don't know,
That
overwhelming.
Yeah, well, sometimes when I go to a place, I'm like, what's the second best place to go within this great place? Because if it's the most famous place, then certain type of people are going to want to go there. And I'm like, okay, I don't need to go to the best place. What's the like next tier that's still awesome, but like isn't as quite famous? And that usually works pretty well for me.
Yeah, I would stay away from the Kenai Peninsula. I went there with my wife for our honeymoon, and we fished for king salmon and sockeye and trout, and had a lot of fun. But it's just,
Mm,
you have 6 feet between you and the next person, and it's
yeah,
just, and
that's
they're
tough.
they're doing a lot of flossing, which I mean, if you're just trying to get meat, then but yeah, it's just
Yeah.
not that's not it.
You want a little privacy on your honeymoon and on your fishing honeymoon too, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Well, where can people pick up the book? Go to the Substack, subscribe to the podcast. Where can they do all that?
Yeah, the book's available at any, I would just say this about independent bookstores, having nothing to do with my book. If you want a book, they will get you a book, usually in 2 days, maybe in Alaska a little longer. But if I go to my local bookstore, Three Lives here in the West Village in Manhattan, if they don't have something I want, I just tell them what I do want and they order it. And then I come in and it's very nice and I get to see someone have a little human connection and I like to support them. So your local bookstore is great, but obviously Big Bezos, one click, get a discount. You can get it on Amazon. And the contender is my Substack. If you find me on Instagram, David Coggins, there's usually links to all various parts of my little corner of the universe. And then the Central Division podcast, which is also findable through there some way. Links and clicks and words
Hmm.
and images and a couple of release videos.
Yeah, yeah, not too many, just a few.
Yeah, exactly. Tasteful number.
Well, it was really nice chatting with you.
Yeah.
Thanks for taking the time out of your day, and good luck with the salmon.
Thank you, Jeff. Really appreciate it. Great to talk to you.
Take care.
Record.